Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the fourth of our series, The Legacy of Brown v. Board of Education in the Ongoing Struggle for Justice, as part of a course offered by the Interdisciplinary Studies Department, but also as part of John Jay's outreach to the entire John Jay, CUNY, and New York City community. My name is Michael Mirapome. I and my colleague Jessica Gordon-Nembard are the curators of this series and also the instructors in the accompanying ISP course. Before we get to tonight's event, I want to remind everybody that Monday, the 24th of February, in this very room, we will hear from Dr. Edmund W. Gordon, who will speak on reflections on over 90 years of experience from the back of the bus to the struggle for educational excellence. Dr. Gordon was one of Dr. Kenneth Clark's graduate students back in 1953, and he has had and continues to have, as a young nonagenarian, a phenomenal career in education, an event not to be missed. Followed by a week later, a talk/performance by Peter Yarrow of Peter, Paul, and Mary, talking about music as a force for justice. Tonight, John Jay College and the ISP program is absolutely ecstatic about having Dr. Pedro Noguera here. I have a description of his many awards and experiences that will take away much too much from his time, so I'm going to try to take a meat axe to it. He is Peter L. Agnew Professor of Education at NYU. He's a sociologist whose scholarship and research focuses on the ways in which schools are influenced by social and economic conditions and the factors that obstruct and promote student achievement. He holds tenured faculty appointments in the departments of Teaching and Learning and Humanities and Social Sciences at the Steinhardt School of Culture, Education, and Development at NYU. He is the executive director of the Metropolitan Center for Urban Education and co-director of the Institute for the Study of Globalization and Education in Metropolitan Settings. He received a bachelor's degree in sociology and history and a teaching credential from Brown University, master's degree in sociology from Brown, doctorate in sociology from UC Berkeley. He's been a classroom teacher in public schools. He has held tenured positions at Harvard Graduate School of Education, the University of California, Berkeley, where he was also director of the Institute for the Study of Social Change. Published over 150 research articles, monographs, and research reports on topics such as urban school reform, conditions that promote student achievement, youth violence, the role of education and community development in national and international contexts, and race and ethnic relations in American society. He appears as a regular commentator on educational issues and other topics on CNN, NPR, and other nationalist news outlets. I will not go into the list of books. As I said, you'd rather hear from him than from me. Then I have 15 listed honors. I will only tell you 5 of them. Honorary doctorates from 3 institutions: University of San Francisco, Bank Street College, and Lewis and Clark College. He received the Border Crosser Award for Leadership in Promoting Racial Understanding and Justice, and the Martin Luther King Award from New York University. I lied, I'll give you a 6th one. The Whitney Young Award for Leadership in Education. Today his topic is educational reform and civil rights for the 21st century. It is our great pleasure to welcome Dr. Pedro Noguera.
Good evening. Thank you for the warm introduction. Thank you, Jessica, or Professor Gordon, for inviting me, and thank all of you for staying around late this evening for the presentation. I see some people yawning already. But good to be here at John Jay. I haven't been here in a while, at least not in an academic role. So nice to be back again. Given that this is the 60th anniversary of the Brown decision, I thought it would be good to kind of discuss the significance of that important verdict. And particularly because so many leaders today like to say that education is the civil rights issue of the 21st century, and that includes people like the President Obama or former Mayor Mike Bloomberg and many, many others. I think it's important then to really look and, okay, what does that mean? What does it mean to say, and what do those leaders mean when they say that education is a civil rights issue of this century? So let me start, though, by looking backward and why this decision is still so important. And I would say that what Brown did is to end legally sanctioned apartheid in America. Okay. That is, until Brown, we had, both by law and by practice in many parts of the country, what really amounted to apartheid. In fact, there's some evidence that the apartheid government mirrored in many of its laws and policies after the practices that were occurring in this country, in the South. And as we know, we came to a point where the existence of apartheid, particularly after the United States was supposedly defending the free world in World War II, became a bit of a contradiction, made America look like a hypocrite. And so there was great political pressure to try to change that, and it's not surprising that they appointed a politician to actually head the Supreme Court, Earl Warren, who had been governor of California, who was able to engineer this unanimous verdict. And when they did, it's important that we look closely at the language. Because there was a clause added to the verdict. It wasn't simply end it. They said end it with all deliberate speed. And what it turns out is that was a kind of sarcastic way of saying, we don't expect this to happen right away. Okay. Now, what's important about it is that when the case for ending segregation was being made, there were at least three important arguments that were being heard. First was the argument of the Brown family, right? They were the plaintiffs, right, in Topeka, Kansas, who basically said, you know what, our kids should not have to travel miles away to go to school when there's a school right here in our neighborhood. And the only thing preventing that is racial discrimination, and that should be changed. Right? And it's not to say they didn't have bigger goals, but it was almost that practical, right? And they were pushing for that. And then they brought in Kenneth Clark, and you heard about Dr. Kenneth Clark already, the psychologist who said, well, you know, there's evidence that the practice of segregation has a negative impact on the psyche of the, black children, on their identity. It reinforces a negative sense of self. And they did the experiment, which is now famous with the dolls, where black children were choosing white dolls over black dolls, and again, used that to suggest that this was part of the stain of segregation on black children. But as we know now, mostly from research on the work that went on within the NAACP, Thurgood Marshall, who led the case, and his colleagues had something else in mind too. That is, they saw ending segregation as the way to create some degree of equity in schools. Because it wasn't merely a matter of separate, because the fact of the matter was, although the Plessy decision, right, which all of segregation was based on legally, had said separate but equal, the fact of the matter was it was never equal. It was just separate. And in fact, in most cases, wherever there was a facility or a school or a bus for black people, it was always inferior to that what was made available to whites. And so Marshall felt that if they could find a way through education to promote some degree, to challenge the inequity, it might actually open the door to challenging those inequities in other parts of society, and they were right. Because what Brown did was it set precedent for ending segregation, not just in education, but in housing in transportation, in employment, in all of that. Everything started crumbling once Brown passed. And it also turns out that this is the 50th anniversary this year of the Civil Rights Act, right, which represents the culmination of that process of ending all of the legal vestiges of segregation in America. Now, note I put the emphasis on legal. And the reason why I did is because it's very important to recognize and remember that racial segregation wasn't merely a legal system. It was a cultural system. It was a social system rooted in the economy of the country. And undoing that was going to prove to be a lot harder. In fact, part of the reason why we still have so many highly segregated schools across America, in fact, schools are more segregated now than they were in the 1970s. And if you look at the work of the Civil Rights Project at UCLA, you can see the recent study showing New York State to have some of the most segregated schools in the nation. And New York was never thought of as a highly segregated state. But today they're segregated by practice, not by law. There's no sign out saying no black children can go to school at this school, or no white children can go to school, or boys and girls high school. But guess what? There's no white kids out there. And so it is understanding why and how those inequities and those separations have maintained that becomes, I think, really important today. And really the question is, does it still matter? Is it something we should care about? Now, the fact of the matter is, we can only infer that the federal government doesn't care about it anymore because we haven't heard him mention it. President Obama, Congress, nobody's talking about segregation as a problem anymore, which, when we consider the history, is amazing. Because this country fought a bloody war over school segregation after the decision. The first time, well, since the Civil War, that federal troops were sent into a city to reinforce a federal order was in Little Rock, Arkansas, when a Republican president called on the military to usher in 9 African-American students to Central High School in Little Rock. And Boston, the bastion of liberalism, became one of the bloodiest battles for desegregation in the country. That went on over several years. And in Prince William, Virginia, you actually had white parents who boycotted school for several years because they were opposed to desegregation. So when you consider the battles that were fought throughout the country, in many communities, and it took different forms in different places, the fact that it's a non-issue today says a lot. Now, part of the reason why it's a non-issue is because the courts have since changed their positions. And one of the most important changes was a decision that was rendered in the Milliken case in the 1970s, where the court said, in the case of Detroit, that when Detroit wanted to expand its deseg plan to include the white suburbs, the court said, no, there's no evidence that the white suburbs segregated, so you can't integrate with them. Detroit will have to integrate with itself, which basically meant that Detroit would have segregated schools. And then just a few years ago, in the cases of Louisville and Seattle, parents versus the public schools, there was a voluntary deseg case in both cities that the court said even that is no longer necessary. And so the courts basically, in recent years, have said, desegregation is not our thing. They haven't completely said, let's go back to segregated schools, but they have basically taken away all of the legal tools to challenge the segregated status quo. Because we have to ask ourselves, how is it possible that we end up with schools so highly segregated in cities throughout America today if the law says they're not supposed to be? Well, that's because now it's based on residence, now it's based on various ways of screening kids out of certain schools. So less than 5% of the kids at Bronx Science are from the Bronx. Right? I think there were no African-American students admitted to Stuyvesant last year. But that's not because of discrimination in the old sense. That's because of the admissions strategies they use and policies they use that the courts have upheld. And so it's a different terrain that we're operating in. And so even as we look and reflect upon where we are as a country and the legacy, what does the legacy of Brown mean for us today at a time when the country is more diverse than ever and becoming even more so, so that by the year 2040, this country will be a nation where people of color are the majority. And that's happening not because of immigration anymore, it's happening because of reproduction. White people aren't having enough babies. And black and brown people are having lots of babies. So the country's changing, but the country is more fragmented than ever and more divided than ever. Now, it's not completely, that's not the whole story, because the number of people who are mixed race and intermarried is also going up, to speak to your point. And we can talk about that later, what that means for us. But nonetheless, one of the things that's very interesting right now, because of the companies like Google and others like it that mine data, they know so much about us based simply on where we live. They know what census tract you live in. They know what kind of clothes you like to buy. They know what kind of food you like to eat. They know so many things about you, so they can target ads at you based on that kind of information, in part because they know that in so many parts of the country we live in hyper-segregated communities, segregated by race and class. And so in this social context, we find the effort to try to educate all kids. And what's important about this ongoing journey of America to try to find ways to educate all kids is that the expansion of educational opportunities is completely tied to the expansion of democracy in America. That is, the United States created public schools before most other countries in the world. Long before England, France, most of Europe, we created public schools. And what's interesting about that, we didn't create them through the federal government, we created it through local communities. Local communities starting in Massachusetts came together and said, you know what, we're going to educate our kids at public expense. We're going to tax ourselves to do this. And that idea spread from Massachusetts to different parts of the country based on this belief that education should serve as the key to opportunity, the equalizer of opportunity. That was the vision, that was the goal. It's totally tied to our idea of the American dream, that you can't have access to opportunity without education. And so it's telling that the last region in the country to get public education was, guess. Guess. What region of the country do you think would be last to get it? The South. The South. And not just for black children, but for white children too. Reconstruction brought public education to the South. Because the South was this agrarian plantocracy where neither black nor poor white children were seen as in need of education because they were the workers who would tend the fields. But Reconstruction brings public education to the South, and as we follow that history, education is what gives women the ability to fully participate, right? Through Title IX. And educational changes in the ADA, the Americans with ADA, Americans with Disability Act, I can't remember exactly, says that no, being disabled should not be a barrier to getting an education. And we get laws like the Lau decision, which says not speaking English should not be a barrier to education. Right. And then even more recently in the Pilot decision, the court said not being undocumented or being undocumented should not deny a child the right to an education. The courts have ruled consistently, every child in America, regardless of status, homeless kids, kids from incarcerated families, undocumented children, they all have the right to go to school. There is no, what's interesting about that, there is no other institution as accessible as public schools. And there is no right to an education mentioned in the U.S. Constitution. It's not a guaranteed right. Nowhere mentioned. But unlike our other rights that are mentioned, those Bill of Rights, which are mostly framed in negative terms. Right? So you have the right to bear arms, but you don't get issued any weapons, fortunately. Right? And you have the right to free speech, but they don't give you access to your own newspaper or radio station. Right? And you have the right to practice your religion, but we're not going to build you a church or a synagogue or anything else. Right? But education is actually an entitlement. You get something. You get a good. The right to send your child to school. In fact, it's not just a right, it's a requirement. You have to send your child to school. If you decide to homeschool, you need to get a permission. And what's important about that entitlement is it not only entitles your child to the opportunity to learn, depending, of course, on the quality, but you get a meal, maybe two, because lunch and breakfast now typical in most schools in America, access to a nurse if there is one, heat in the winter, adult supervision, which, when you think about it, there's no other institution that does that for children. No other institution is that accessible. Our public schools are the most important part of the safety net for poor children in America today. I was in Michigan recently, and I met principals who said, we are sending kids home on Fridays with food for the weekend, because we have kids that are no guarantee they'll eat again until Monday. Okay. So this institution is critical to not just American democracy, but to the welfare of American society, especially its children. But it is still profoundly unequal. Because although all children have the right to an education, they don't get a right to an equal education. And throughout America, we consistently spend the most money to educate the wealthiest children and the least money to educate the poorest children. And that has an impact on the quality of schools you're in, what teachers get paid, kind of facilities you have access to. And that's obvious, right? You go to some schools and they don't have any fields to play on, much less a swimming pool, may not have many books in the library, particularly here in New York City where we build our schools tall, right? Usually without elevators either, right? Very different from what you see in the suburbs. Right? Kids have the big playing fields and nice labs. And there is no move afoot to address that inequity, although there have been some important court cases, even here in New York, that said we've got to equalize funding, but both Republican and Democratic governors have largely ignored that court order. Right. So we have this public education system that's vital to serving the welfare needs of children, but so frail, so unequal, because no other institution is doing what schools have to do. And no other institution is providing support to poor children the way that schools do. Problem is that our policymakers have completely ignored that. Right? That is, not only have they ignored the reality of segregation, but they have focused narrowly now, particularly since No Child Left Behind became law, on raising standards and holding schools and kids, and now if they get their way, teachers accountable for outcomes based on test scores. Now, what's interesting about that is No Child Left Behind was adopted with the support of civil rights organizations like the NAACP and the National Council de la Raza and others that said, we need this, because they were concerned that so many kids were graduating from school functionally illiterate, because there were no standards. And if you just basically put in your time and were well-behaved, you could get a high school diploma in lots of places. And your diploma meant nothing because there was no guarantee that you were actually educated. So President Bush, based on what he'd done in Texas, said, we want evidence that these kids can learn, so we're going to test them. And we use the test for accountability. And it seemed to make sense to many people at first, except what ended up happening is the only evidence we looked at was how well they did on a test. And over time, what that meant is anything that wasn't on the test was increasingly taken away from children. And so in some states where science wasn't on the test, science was taken away. When music's not on the test, definitely music is not unnecessary, and art certainly not on the test, and neither is physical education or recess. And so even though obesity is the #1 health issue facing poor kids, especially in America today, you go to schools today that have no art, no music, no recess, no PE. But be clear about this, those are schools that serve poor kids. Middle-class kids still get art, music, and recess and the whole thing. And so ironically, a law that was adopted, No Child Left Behind, a slogan that came not from the Bush administration, but from the Children's Defense Fund. And when Marian Wright Edelman coined the term, leave no child behind, it didn't mean test the children as frequently as possible. She had a different vision. It was about nutrition and health and making sure that the basic needs of children were being met. But that's not part of policy today. Not part of No Child Left Behind, not part of Race for the Top, not part of any of that. Equity is not mentioned. So if you think about it, not only aren't we fulfilling the legacy of Brown, we're not even fulfilling the legacy of Plessy. Plessy said separate but equal. Now we just have separate and profoundly unequal. Profoundly unequal. And in place of equity, we have accountability. And we have ample evidence right now that it's not working. Not working if the goal is to ensure that all kids get educated. New York City, which was, at least under Mike Bloomberg, an experiment site for many reforms, right? So under Mike Bloomberg, the number of charter schools expanded. We have over 200 charter schools now in New York City. Harlem has some of the most of all areas, Central Harlem. Closed more schools, over 150 schools closed under Mike Bloomberg, because his mantra was going to close the failing schools, and still have a dropout rate of just about 65%. And when you disaggregate that to look at African American and Latino males in particular, less than 40%. Something's wrong with the picture. And what's wrong with it is that we completely ignore the fact that the non-academic needs of children impact academic outcomes. Hungry kids don't do well in school. Kids without stable housing will miss many days and will switch schools often. Kids who need to get eyeglasses will have trouble reading. The number of children in homeless shelters, 150,000 children right now, grew under Mike Bloomberg. Homeless children tend not to do very well in school. Kids in foster care, kids in group homes tend not to do well in school. And let's be clear, not because there's something wrong with those children. Because I think that one of the things that happens in America is we have a tendency, when we look at those data, we think there's something wrong with those kids. That somehow, maybe cognitively, their brain doesn't work the same way, or simply their parents don't value education. I can point to schools right now where poor kids, homeless kids, immigrant kids who don't speak English, kids in foster care are excelling right now in New York City. There's one in the back. And the existence of those schools is all the proof you need to know. The problem is not the children. The problem is the fact that we have not created the conditions in the schools that would allow a greater number of children to be successful. Because that's not been the focus of our policy. We had a study done. It was kept secret for a long time in New York City by a consulting group. They advised the Department of Education about what to do about the high schools. And the study said, you know what? When you concentrate the neediest kids into one school, you pretty much guarantee that that school will fail. When you put too many special ed kids, too many level 1 kids, too many non-English speakers, and then staff it with your least experienced teachers, which was the model, right? Put Teach for America, Urban Teaching Fellows, right? That's who we'll put in there, because who else wants that job? Right? And they'll only stay 2-3 years, but so what? We got a whole army supply, they keep coming. And what the data showed, they always fail. And the only thing that Bloomberg had for those schools said, then we'll shut them down. And the ironic thing is they shut down schools they created. They didn't just shut down old schools, they shut down new schools that were created by them. And never stopped to ask, what's wrong with our strategy? For example, they adopted a policy to end what we call social promotion. Social promotion is when you promote someone because of their age, not because of their ability. Right? So you say, you're a little too old for elementary school, you got a beard now, we're going to send you to middle school. All right? But that kid still can't read. And so Bloomberg said, oh no, we're going to end social promotion. We're going to retain the children. Retain them. If they can't read, if they can't master the work, we're going to hold them back in 3rd grade, in 6th grade, in 8th grade. Sounded like a tough measure, right? Except we still ended up with all these kids going to high school who couldn't read. Why? Well, another year of what you just failed at is not an intervention, is it? Unless we figure out why you failed, why you're not reading. But we didn't ask those kinds of questions. Instead, what we did was use threats and pressure and fear as a strategy for improvement. And we have lots of evidence that fear is not an effective strategy at getting things better. Fear moves people, though, doesn't it? You threaten someone with their job, they'll do things like cheat. Right? You say, my job's at stake? Well, get that eraser. I'm going to get you these kids' scores up. That's one way to get them up. And you know another way to get scores up? Push out kids that'll bring them down. Keep them out of your school. Right? So Brandeis High School, not far from here, right over by the Museum of Natural History. There was a failing school, so finally said, we're going to shut it down. But instead of creating a new school for the kids that were in that failing school, who's there now? Kids from the Upper West Side. Mostly white. Where are the kids who went to Old Brandeis? They're somewhere back up in the Bronx or in Washington Heights. Shell game. I cite this because when we talk about education as a civil rights issue of the 21st century, we've got to ask questions, well, if it is that important, I think it is. Because today, they don't discriminate you, at least legally, based on your race when you go to apply for a job. But if you don't have the credentials, they say, you're not qualified. You can't apply. So education becomes a way to rationalize screening people out of opportunity. So it is a civil rights issue. It's a fundamental human rights issue in terms of access to opportunity. But what we have done very little of is addressing that basic opportunity to learn and ensuring that all kids, regardless of their backgrounds, have that opportunity. Now we have a new mayor. And so far, Bill de Blasio says he's going to not be like Bloomberg, but the only thing he's talked about is preschool. Expanding access to preschool. Now that's a great thing because all the research says we need to start early because the learning that occurs while a child is small actually will benefit them throughout their life. And we should know that kids who arrive at school not ready to learn will always be behind. So it makes a lot of sense to invest in preschool. But guess what? If all you do is invest in preschool, nothing's going to change. Because if the kids coming from good preschools go right back into lousy elementary schools, what happens? All the benefits get undone. And one of the things that scares me about de Blasio is it seems too political, because he says he wants to do it right now. Well, guess what? You can't do it right now. You don't have the teachers. Where are all these highly qualified preschool teachers going to come from? And where are you going to put all these 4-year-olds? 70,000 kids that are not now in schools, because we already have overcrowded schools. So although I like some of the slogans, I don't see a plan from Mayor de Blasio. Now tomorrow I get to meet with the Chancellor, Carmen Freeney. I'm going to ask her, where's your plan? Because she's an educator. And already I like something different about what's coming out of her mouth. You heard about the school in Far Rockaway that they said was the school of no, the school where they're firing that principal because the kids had no textbooks and she was missing regular days of school and claiming it, right? So they're going to fire her now. And the chancellor sent in a representative to figure out what was going on and came back and said, you know what, school has lots of problems, but the school also has assets. We're going to build on the assets. And I like that because she understands what Joel Klein and Dennis Walcott didn't understand. Note, I didn't even mention Kathy Black because that was just a waste of time, right? That her job is not to close schools, her job is to improve schools. Now the question is, does she have a plan for how to do that? Because we have 1,700 schools more in New York City, 1.1 million children. That's a lot of schools to be responsible for, to plan for. And many of the schools in the poorest neighborhoods are going to need more than just a good principal. They're going to need social workers. They're going to need school psychologists. They're going to need coats in the winter. They're going to need a whole lot more because the kids need more. And again, as I mentioned, there are schools right now in New York City that are doing that. And usually they're doing it either because they have a partnership with some other entity like the Children's Aid Society or Good Shepherd that is bringing those resources in, or they're doing it because the principal is so damn resourceful, she's figuring out a way to get the help in the school to serve the needs of the kids. There aren't many of them, but they exist. And where they exist, you see kids thriving. School like PS 28 out in Bedford-Stuyvesant got the highest gains in literacy and math 2 years ago. 40% of the students homeless. 40%. School I work with, it's a transfer school for kids who get kicked out of the traditional schools, last chance school it's in kind of Fort Greene, called the Community School for Leadership and Service. Met a young man who lived in the stairwell of his building for a year because his family moved and he decided he wanted to stay. Fed by his neighbors. Graduating valedictorian of his school. I said, how'd you do that? He said, because I have a family at this school that supports me. There are schools like that in New York City. The sad thing is that we don't know about those schools. They're not elevated. People aren't learning from those schools. I can take you to another school in the Bronx where every single one of those students is a recent immigrant, most of them from the Caribbean, from the Dominican Republic. And every single one of those, they have a 98% graduation rate, even though most of those kids were not attending school in their native country. They come to school illiterate in Spanish. We know how to educate kids. What we lack in New York, what we lack in America is the will to ensure that it happens. That's what we lack. What we lack is a focus on equity and opportunity and how to make sure that that's real in our schools. So next time you hear someone saying education is a civil rights issue of the 21st century, then say, okay, yeah, then what are you going to do to make that real? Because it can't just be a slogan. It's got to be a plan for how do we expand opportunity through education. Fact of the matter is that we shouldn't just do it through education. We've got to do economic development. We've got to do housing. We've got to do better health care. You can't only reform education and expect society will become more equal just because you made schools better. But making schools better would take us a long way too, though. And there was a time in this country not too long ago when we did have a war on poverty, when we were trying to think more broadly about how to expand opportunity for people. We're not in those times now. But if we are going to be serious about education, we got to do more than preschool. And we got to do preschool well. We got to find ways to create conditions in schools where kids are excited about learning. That's what we should be focused on. Think about that, what I just said. Schools where kids are excited about learning, not schools that raise achievement. If you tell the schools, raise achievement, what do? They're going to focus more on the test. If you say, no, get them excited about learning, what are they going to do? They're going to have to get creative, aren't they? They're going to have to figure out some way to get these kids engaged, some way to get them motivated. And if we did that, guess what? Their scores will go up because they would become willing participants in their education. which is what we should be after, right? Rather than force feeding them. Really hard to educate someone who doesn't want to be educated, isn't it? But we're not thinking about those things. And so I want to encourage you to recognize that whether or not you have kids in school, that what happens in these schools will affect you too. It will affect you because the people we don't educate are the people we are much more likely to incarcerate. Go visit our jails and prisons and see who's there. And the people we don't educate are the ones that we see on our streets, and the ones who can't find jobs or who are stuck permanently in low-wage jobs, disproportionately. The quality of life in this city will be affected by how we educate the children. Has been before, it will continue to be so. So I encourage you, be an activist for education, for the rights of all children, and understand it is still the civil rights issue of the 21st century. It does matter. Mattered then, it matters now. Thank you.
So what we're going to do now is that a handheld?
Yeah.
Perfect. And we'll, Professor Gordon Nembard will be taking around the thing and speak into the mic, please.
I mean, I have a question based on the last thing you just said about incarceration, and I just want to know, what are your thoughts on, because the incarceration age is getting so much younger, where we have 16 and 17 and 18-year-olds who were in high school and now they're incarcerated for really long times, and we have these prisons who are cutting these education programs. So what are your thoughts about that issue with education, even outside of public schools?
So one of the things I'm going to raise to the chancellor when I meet with her tomorrow is that that's got to become one of our priority areas, is reforming the way we educate kids while they are incarcerated. She controls the schools at Rikers. Right now, 2/3 of the kids who leave will be back in 2 years. That's what the research shows. We could change that. If we were really educating those kids and addressing the other issues, because some of those kids have issues with mental illness and other related challenges, we could significantly reduce the numbers who go in, right, if we had a more therapeutic approach, right, and really focused on educating kids while they're there, providing them with skills. That's not what we're doing now. We're warehousing them. Right? And again, she does have the mayor appointed a very enlightened commissioner for youth corrections, Gladys Carrion. But she needs help, because right now all she's doing is managing a failed system.
Can you hear me? All right. Having gone to I've been in both school settings. I've actually been the only black student in a school. I attended Westlake High School in Pleasantville, New York.
Oh, New York.
Yeah, the onward, Westchester area.
Yeah.
I think it's the third most affluent town in the country, actually. Bill Clinton and Mariah Carey and those guys live out there. And just the experience of the education was so much different. I really kids in the city, I went to Bertram, or I went to Brandeis, for instance. It was the old Brandeis in those days. And they were telling me that, the education was different, but I didn't know until I had to come down, and I actually went to Boys and Girls, and I sat in what was their advanced writing class, and had to write an essay, but my writing was so much more advanced, yet subpar to college, yet subpar to the acceptance of. So I experienced it on my own. It's pretty much what I want to say. But what I feel like is necessary is not just the integration of the people, but the reintegration along with the integration. For instance, some of the teachers that were there, my math teacher in that school was one of the co-creators of AOL. Yet my math teacher here had only been a math teacher here. It was perhaps an urban teaching fellow. So let's not just integrate the students. Let's integrate the teachers, because their mentalities carry over to our culture, their confidence, the way that they boost you. Like, I had trouble in math. I hate math. But because she was, like I said, a co-creator of AOL, she was like, oh, come to my house and we'll tutor on weekends. And that's something I would never experience in a class of 32 in a school of 5,000, you know? So I think that that's something that I would want you to put across tomorrow.
No, I think you made really important points about both the difference, the disparities and how you live them, and the fact that, because the fact is that we're not going to be able to integrate a lot of these schools. The reason why is you can't make middle-class people, white, black, Latino, you can't make them put their kids in bad schools. You can only make poor people put their kids in bad schools who have no other options, right? And so when integrating them is probably not going to be on the horizon anytime soon. However, if we focus on improving the conditions in those schools, because if you want to attract good teachers, you got to improve the work conditions. So the teachers will want to work there and want to stay there. And if we did that, I think that would begin to change things. And that's what I'm hoping they'll focus on over the next few years.
I had so many things to say. You touched on some of them. One thing I noticed, I have a son, and he's been in special ed since he was 7. He was in a Montessori school, and then he changed to a public school. As soon as they changed to a public school, they called ACS on me because they said I was negligent with his learning and education. And it wasn't me. It was actually the school telling me he was doing okay, and I thought he was doing okay. He was a little boy. And then he got to public school in 1st grade. He was already in Montessori for almost 3 years. And then they sent him to a hospital saying that he was sexually abused because he was touching the doll in the middle. And then somebody told me, well, when you are an immigrant, if you go downtown, close to Chambers, there's a lot of complaint about the school, which is on the Upper East Side, about being biased, being prejudiced, racist, whatever. But anyway, that's besides the point. I think that since my son has been put in special education, he's a very smart kid, and he has other issues as well with bipolar disorder, things like that. But he takes medication. But since he was put on that special education program, he feels like the other kids, they label him. And he was actually learning, and he dropped. And every time he went from one school to the next, where they were, the label was a little more intensified, he would drop again. And I kept mentioning to them, just give him a chance. And the chance would be given to other kids, and I noticed there would be a little bit of bias. I felt that way, and the other kids, they would get the chance. And also, I feel that these kids, like my own kid, if they don't succeed at the rate, at the speed they expect them to succeed, some of the schools will push them to schools such as residential schools for kids, which I'm fighting now against the whatever it's the ACS again, because I don't want to put my son in a residential home. I think that there are other ways to help and educate kids and to deal with the problem instead of pushing. This is what I always tell them. You are just making society making life easier for society by pushing these kids out of it. But later on, these kids will come back. And if they come back without the help that they need, they're going to come back as criminals. They're going to come back as with more mental issues, self-esteem issues. And it's not going to contribute. Society is just going to make things worse and worse and worse.
Yeah. So it's interesting because special education, right, was also, when it first started, was framed as a civil rights issue because we were not children with learning disabilities or any range of disabilities were not being given educational opportunities. So the laws were written that you had to give that child a learning plan, the IEP, right, so that we would know exactly what that child's needs were, and then the school had the responsibility to meet that child's need. Right. The problem is that unless parents know how to advocate for the rights of the child, a lot of times the child does not get what they need. Right?
This is what and I know I'll be very quick. We have advocated, we have what the Board of Education
Right.
We have actually one when they try to deny certain rights. When we had the I forgot what the hearing.
The hearing.
And I just find it that it's very limited, the help they give to kids
Yeah.
like that. And because I lived the situation, I think this is a huge issue that goes unseen and unhelped. And
Yeah.
there should be more attention paid to it.
Absolutely.
Because these kids are
Yeah.
literally being neglected.
And the sad thing is, he needs a good diagnosis done on what does he need, right? Because I could take you right now, yours, get that kind of support. So
Hi. One of the things I feel that a lot of people miss out on is, as you were talking about slogans on how to improve, one thing I remember a few years ago, Neil deGrasse Tyson, who is a very famous physicist, he was on Bill Maher, and he made a very valid point. Why do we have politicians who are lawyers or businessmen when you should have like scientists, educators? I think if you had people like that creating legislation, they would really know, as you were talking about, the right, precise pieces to help the education level, rather than saying, well, we're going to do this, and next thing you know, that's put to the wayside or watered down. I mean, for something that shouldn't just be who is in the cabinet of a mayor or whatever. That really falls on us, where we, in communities especially, if we know someone who's very big in education, we should, kind of try to help them, say, why don't you run, because you have great ideas, you were good, this and that. I think that kind of falls on all of us, rather than saying, yeah, I like what he says, and that should work.
right. No, I think that's a huge issue. Education is one of the few fields where many people feel as though they are experts because they went to school. Even if they don't know anything about actually educating anybody. In no other field, we're going to change the healthcare law with the medical professionals, we're going to do something to the military, the generals are going to have a whole lot to say. We do something in education, we rarely will consult teachers or principals, people who've actually been in education. The mayor of Bloomberg made it a point of not hiring an educator, right, to run the schools. Klein was a lawyer, Kathy Black was a publisher, and Dennis Walcott was, I'm not even sure what Dennis was, right? He did teach kindergarten at one point, a long time ago. Arnie Duncan's never been an educator. Right? He worked he was a tutor at one time, right? So.
Can I ask a question following up on that? Because this is as somebody whose wife was a public school teacher for many years, it seems to me that the reason why they don't want to consult educators is that there is a model which says that the problem of education is you've got teachers who have formed these unions and they protect mediocrity. And so you don't want to consult them. You want to figure out a way to force them to do their job, because basically they're not interested in doing their job. They're just interested in getting paid a high salary to not do their job. Now, I don't agree with that, obviously, but I mean, how do you deal with that mentality?
So first thing I would say is sometimes unions do protect people that shouldn't be protected. There's truth to that. I mean, they're literally, just recently, a teacher who was caught with a prostitute in front of the school building in his car, the union is defending because they said he was not doing it at work, right? Had nothing to do with his job performance, right? I mean, I think, undermines the credibility of the union, right? But that being said, the fact of the matter is the highest performing states academically are unionized. Right? Massachusetts is the top performing state, heavily unionized. The weakest states have no unions. The southern states, right? They're the worst in education. So the idea that the union's the problem is not borne out by the facts. Although I could say, to be fair, there are specific cases where we could say unions should not be doing that.
My question, it's not a question, I just want to know like your intake towards with education and with the incarcerated. I have family, friends incarcerated, they're getting education, but I'm a little confused because I'm happy that they're getting their education and but I feel like as us students that are sitting here now, we're struggling to, paying tuition, struggling to, you know, textbooks and everything, where in prisons is probably not even 3/4 close to what we do out
Right.
here, you know. And we're following the law, we're doing everything how we're supposed to be doing, basically going according to the norm. Where incarcerated is like, you know, they're getting, even though they did a wrongful doing, probably not in their sense, but according to the United States law, Constitution, but, and they're still receiving their education. Where I'm saying is like, where we're paying crazy amounts and we're going through that stress, where they have it given to them, even after, you know, they've done something.
Right.
You know, like what would be like your intake on that?
Well, I would say that, first of all, what they're getting is not quality, okay? In terms of the quality of education. Even though, you know, I spent time over there, and you will see small class size. We're spending a lot of money to incarcerate and to educate the children over there, but the quality of what they're getting is inferior. You wouldn't want that for your child, right? And it's not as though they're coming out of there, you know, ready to compete with you at John Jay. That's not what's happening, okay? But even imagine if it worked. I would say it's in your interest as a citizen to see that they get a good education, because it costs too much to keep them in there in the first place.
Because there's been a rising conflict for a while now, right?
What's that?
The conflict with how there's regular college students that are debating with the system that incarcerated are getting education.
Well, I mean, there are a lot of people that are making it harder and harder for them to get, for example, you used to be able to get an associate's degree while you're in prison. Could work on your college degree. And there are a number of states that have taken those opportunities away, even though what the research shows is that when you educate an incarcerated person, they're much less likely to go back to jail again, right? So it's cost effective to do that, right? Rather than seeing it as a waste, it's actually saving you money to educate them, right? So,
Well, can you hear me?
yes.
Okay. I don't know if everybody here is aware of it, but there's certain school, which I will not name, even colleges, university, that to keep what is called a high standard, they will choose not to admit certain student, not based on academic achievement, but race. I myself, I wouldn't call it a victim, because at the end of the day, I did fight for my rights, and I did got in the high school that at the time was one of the top 10 high school. But I also experienced that in college, because there are programs called remedial math in English. And although you may go and take those exams and pass those exams, when they are being qualified, most of the teachers will look for idiotic mistakes to fail you, to keep you in those programs, because they need the funds, one, and two, because they want to keep that standard. And I don't know if everybody here knows about that, and
Yeah.
what do you think about it? How can we address it as students?
It's a huge problem. We have, 80% of the students right now coming out of New York City public schools who go to CUNY have to take those courses, those remedial courses, which they get no credit for, right? And I don't even know, can you get financial aid for those courses? Yeah. You can? Okay. But you're not making credits to making progress, right? So it's a huge problem. Now, what do you do about it, though? I think what we got to do is we got to do a better job of preparing them in high school so that they don't have to take those courses, right? And that, I think, speaks to the failure of the past 12 years, that that was never really looked at, never really addressed. So, but it's a huge problem, right? Because, a lot of people don't have the time and money to take these classes, not be working, and not making progress. So it's a real problem. I understand it.
Good afternoon. I want to say my grandfather was an immigrant, so as to the why foreigners do better in schools is because he was an advocate for schools on his kids. My dad and his brother walked 2 miles to and from school every day. So I want to say, in a sense, it's like we've gotten spoiled and expect things that aren't necessarily deemed to us. The education is, as you stated, sorry about this, education is opportunity. But a lot of kids nowadays, they don't do it. They cut school, things like that. Where do you draw the line between holding the school accountable and holding the student themselves accountable?
So I think, ideally, everyone's got to be accountable, right? Parents have to be accountable, children have to be accountable, the school, the educators have to be accountable. Everyone's got to be accountable for what they do in the process. Problem is, right now, we don't have that. That's not the case, right? And while it's true, many immigrant children do have more drive than non-immigrant children. Because if you come from a place where education wasn't guaranteed, right? And you get to America, you say, wow, this is great, it's free, I'm gonna go, because think about it, immigrants do the hardest jobs in America, right? Why? Because they tend to have that drive in ways that Americans don't have it, okay? Because they have their eyes on the prize, they also have their memory about what life is like back home, right? And they're trying to help folks back home, so that gives them also incentive to do it. But we can't build a system just based on what the people with the most drive can do, right? The fact is that some people, based on their circumstances, have not been, that desire to learn wasn't cultivated in them, right? And again, we can't afford to have a society where we have large numbers of people who are just unemployable, which is what we have right now. We have too many people. Think about this, Social Security, right? Which hopefully all of us will be entitled to at some point, right, when we get old enough. The way it works is the people who retire are dependent on the people who are working to pay into the system so that they can retire. If you don't have enough people working, it doesn't work. So we need more people to be educated and employed to take care of the old people, right? Old people should be the biggest advocates for education. In 1964, we had 28 workers to one retiree. Right now, we have 3 workers to one retiree. It's a problem, a huge problem, right? And so we need to make sure there are more people working, earning money, right? It's in our interest, and see, the problem is, because I want you to think about his question, right? A lot of times we think, it's very easy to go into blaming people for their laziness. And not to say there's not lazy people out there. A lot of lazy people out who don't value education. But then we have to ask the question, why? Right? Because guess what? All children, from the time they're born, start learning. All children. Anybody have any babies? Got a few people with babies. How does a baby start learning?
Imitating you.
Watching their parents, imitation, putting things in their mouth. They're learning from, now the research shows, almost from the time their eyes open. Right? Almost from the time their eyes open. And now what we know about the brain is that learning can continue well into adulthood with the right stimulation. Problem is, we're not really good at continuing to stimulate that brain, right, in children. If we could do that, we would be developing the potential of people a lot better than we do right now. And the fact is, there are other countries that do a much better job than we do, like Canada, right, just north of us. So.
Okay. I went to school upstate, and even in the suburbs, there's a great disparity between the school, based on geography,
Sure.
between the schools that have money and the schools that don't. And I unfortunately went to one that didn't, which was also, probably the ethnic breakdown was a third black, a third Hispanic, a third white. And ours was a school that stayed open on every snow day because we couldn't afford to lose the funding. We didn't have enough textbooks for everyone to read. Teachers brought in chalk, they brought in school supplies. But the neighboring school districts had lacrosse, they had swimming pools, they had fields. We didn't have a ground, we had a building, we walked 2 blocks to our track, the city track. So my question for you is, it's obviously a big problem with the disparity of income. How do we go about equalizing the funding that the schools get?
Well, in New York State, there was a lawsuit filed by a group called the Campaign for Fiscal Equity, and the courts ruled that this is interesting, the judge ruled in the case that the schools must provide every child in New York State with an education that would prepare them to sit on a jury. That should be the standard. Right? We require anybody who can vote can sit on a jury. Right? Well, think about how much you really know to make an intelligent, informed decision on a jury. Right? Minimum, you need to read, right? You need to understand arguments, right? And they call that an adequate education. That's what the court ruled. And the court then said, to do that, New York City and many other communities across New York State would need millions more dollars to be caught up to those affluent areas. Well, as I said, the governors, starting with Pataki, have basically ignored that order. It's still not even on Cuomo. Ask, if you get to see Cuomo, ask him, when are you going to fund that initiative, right? It's not even on the agenda. So that's, again, one of those equity issues. You know, I always say money matters. The only people who say money doesn't matter are people who have a lot of money, right? That's when they say, oh, this money's not the issue. It matters because it affects all those things you described in terms of the resources schools have.
Hi, hello. Oh, I just wanted to know, what was your intake on charter schools? Because, like you said, everyone is supposed to get education. You actually, like, basically will get in trouble if you don't send your child to school. But public schools versus charter schools, because, like, charter schools, there's a lottery to get in, and charter schools, they give a better education than the public schools are giving, and their teachers are not hired under the tender laws, so their performance is how, basically get hired and how they evaluate it. So I just want to know, what was your take on public schools versus the charter schools?
I have nothing against charter schools. I mean, I think we need to mix up the system. I have nothing. I'm in favor of good schools, whether it be good public, private, charter. If it's doing a good job educating kids, I support the school. And what is sad to me is that the good charter schools, we're not even learning from what they're doing, right? And using that to influence what's happening in the public schools. Sometimes they're in the same building, and there's no information being shared about what they're doing, right? So I'm not against that. What concerns me about the way charter schools function, that lottery that seems so fair, it's not fair. Certain families are never in the lottery, right? Homeless people are not in the lottery. Undocumented people not in the lottery, right? So what ends up happening is charter school opens up. I'll give you an example. One of the top performing charter schools in the state is in Harlem, 118th Street, Success Academy. Right? One of the top 20 schools in the state. It's in the same building with a failing school. The failing school, 50% of the kids are homeless. There's not one homeless child at Success Academy. How come? If they did it by lottery? Well, guess what? Some people, they don't even know when school starts, much less there's a lottery. Right? So a lottery is no guarantee for equity and access. Right? But it's not an argument against charter schools to me, but it is to say we need to make sure that we are not concentrating the neediest children in certain schools, which is what's happening now, and even increased more in some cases. There are a lot of English language learners not in the charter schools, or kids with learning disabilities.
Hi. You briefly mentioned the whole de Blasio tax preschool thing. I know he's also working on after-school programs for middle school students. I'm not sure what he's doing with the high school, but it's obviously an issue as 23% of high schoolers are not prepared for college and 13% of Black and Latinos are not prepared for college.
I mean, only 13% are.
Correct. Yeah. Sorry. That it was drastically low. It was drastically lower in the Black and Latino communities. I remember seeing him on TV, and he said that it would cost the amount of like a soy latte at Starbucks per day for people making over $500,000 in like the taxes. That's how much it would cost. You mentioned like actual buildings and proper like qualified teachers. Obviously, we need more than just money. So what else do we need to make that happen?
Well, that's what I mean. They need a more comprehensive plan than I've heard. Right? Even the after-school programs, which I totally support, they only work if they're high quality, right? Otherwise, what is it? It's a babysitting program where kids are running around the school. Now, parents are still happy, at least they got a place to put their kid, but the benefit is not going to be realized because it's not quality. So it has to be quality. The preschool, the after-school, but then we also got to think about the high schools. It's like, it's a big system, and you can't just focus. That's like, someone comes to your house, and your house is a mess. They say, well, let's clean up the bathroom. So that's great, but, what about the bedroom? We got rats in the bedroom. We got to do something over there, too, right? We got to fix up the whole house, right? And they're not looking at the whole picture right now, and that's what worries me. I also worry that if they try to do it too fast, they're not going to do it well. If they end up taxing people and then they create a bad system, they're going to really have hell to pay, right? Because say you taxed us and then you wasted our money on something that failed, right? So I just hope they are wise enough to do this well, you know.
Good evening. My question is about student athletes. You know, you have a lot of the top 100 players in each sport that, you know, they kind of get to go to whatever school they want to, but it's a lot of student athletes that aren't prepared to be accepted into a lot of schools. You know, a lot of them, they don't have the support to be serious about education, and I was wondering, is this ever an issue that's brought up when it comes to creating programs for schools?
It's being brought up. I mean, I don't know if you saw this story that came out about the University of North Carolina. That a woman who was a reading tutor for the athletes came out and said the average reading level for the athlete, the ball players at UNC, one of the top college basketball programs in the country, was a third grade reading level. Right? And when she came out with that, she got death threats from all the alumni saying, "Why are you attacking the team?" Because they don't care about whether or not those kids actually get an education. What they care about is whether or not they win, because they see that as entertainment, right? And the sad thing is that the athletes, they are complicit in their own exploitation, right? Right. I mean, it's a sad thing. You know, like I said, the athletes a lot of times are complicit in their own exploitation. They're enjoying to play the ball. I like to play ball, you know, but guess what? If you get no education and you hurt your knee, now you're an uneducated, limping person, right? You know, and how many people we know like that, right? Because, so it's a huge problem, the way we look at sports. But here's the other really sad thing. If a kid can play ball, we will find a way to give that kid opportunity. We will find, a kid could come from the poorest housing project there is. If they're big and can play ball and slam dunk, we're going to find a way to get that kid an opportunity. That's because we value sports. We don't value other things, right? And what does that do? It means we see all these kids out there playing ball till late at night. They can't even play, but they're playing because they got the hoop dreams, meanwhile, not studying. Because, why? Because our society says that's valuable, that's important, that's where prestige is, not in being whatever you guys are studying here at John Jay. All right, thank you all. Thanks for that chance to come.